All right, good morning and welcome to the Working Conservative. Today it's my honor to interview R.A. Janmohamed, author of the conservative book Two Islands and a Tortoise. So let's bring him on. Welcome, Ari.
Welcome. It's good to be here this morning.
So we're going to be asking you a couple questions here about the book and how you got inspired to write it. But first, man, I got to get your thoughts on the Democratic debate. What you thought of it on Wednesday and having Michael Bloomberg and a whole different dynamic. What's stuck out to you about that debate?
I'll be honest, it was nice to actually finally see some passion from the candidates. I thought it was pretty interesting. The gloves certainly came off. But if I was Michael Bloomberg, I mean, I'd be pretty disappointed. 400 million just doesn't buy charisma,
Yeah.
to be honest.
So, talk to me a little bit about the book that you've written and what inspired you to do that.
Sure. A couple of years ago, I just started noticing the extreme political environment that we were living in. And to be honest, just like a lot of other parents out there, I fear for this for my kids. I fear this political climate because it's not healthy. The division is something I don't want them to be growing up in and to think that this is how politics really are.
Right.
So, the motivation came behind just providing a basic education to my kids in a way that's easy enough for them to understand once they reach maybe high school,
Yeah.
so they can and talk intelligently and have a reasonable perspective on politics,
Yeah.
and then make decisions from there.
Yeah. I mean, talking about kids, I've got two myself, and I think that's what drew me to your book the most was I'm trying to find ways to be able to educate them and start to share the things that I've learned in my life in a way that makes sense to them, right? In a way that they're going to find appealing. Because I think for folks like for you and I, we've grown up. We learned about the Soviet Union in history books. I mean, I was born before it fell, and so for me, when I hear socialism or communism, that word has a lot of historical meaning. But what about for some of these young voters, especially the ones that are considering Bernie Sanders? What would you say to them, especially based upon what you've written?
Sure, and I guess I'll just start off by saying I completely understand where a lot of these people, maybe under 30, why they see Bernie's message as appealing. I mean, for most of these voters' lives since 2001, the U.S. has been in a war in the Middle East. They went to college after the 2008 financial crisis, and they saw rising tuition, large student debt. After they graduated, they entered a weak workforce, and so they had to accept lower paying jobs. So I completely get why they might be looking for a change. Um, so the basic message that I would have to these younger voters would be to please just look at the history of the last 100 years, and especially of the literally millions of people who have already lived under the policies that Bernie Sanders is proposing, or at least some variation of them,
Yeah.
and just hear what they have to say first.
Yeah.
That's in my book, and before you jump on his campaign with
Yeah.
2 feet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it well there, talking about the history of their own life, so what they've actually experienced versus the larger context of human history and things that have happened, over the course of thousands of years. Um, but in many ways, I tend to experience Bernie Sanders voters as ahistorical, right? So what I would say by that is that they don't see themselves as bound by precedent or past experience. I think that speaks to the whole postmodern aspect that is very much a part of our culture, where we don't spend a lot of time comparing ourselves to past generations or, really thinking about how we fit in the broader narrative of human history. We're more focused on what's happened today with the 24/7 news cycle and all of that. So tell me, why does history matter? I asked you that question. I was when I was in college, I had some friends of mine, including my roommate, who was left leaning, and he was wondering why I was studying like Aristotle or why I'm looking into Thomas Aquinas or these thinkers from hundreds, if not thousands, of years ago. He's like, why are you
Yeah.
worried about them? Shouldn't we be focused on the future? So then the question for you is why does history matter to us and to these young voters who are going to be running the country very soon?
Sure. This might be a little blunt, but put simply, I've just noticed that people are ahistorical until they can find examples that they like.
Yeah.
Okay, so when When I was single, I was ahistorical, I meant. I was ahistorical about maybe the bad dates I had, okay, but it doesn't change the fact that they happened.
Yeah.
Um, okay, history matters because, in my opinion, it attaches accountability.
Yeah.
There's a precedent to judge against, and without acknowledging that precedent, it's so easy to come up with these grand big experiments, repeat the mistakes of the past, and round we go. We're trying to reinvent the wheel again and again. So, in my opinion, history really just serves as a way to build on it, to build on itself
Yeah.
over time, which is what causes civilization to progress,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Burke
you know,
about it being experience as a guide, right? You know, the philosopher that we base this channel on, he often referenced a national identity, and he talked about society being a contract between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are yet to be born. And he tried to get people to see themselves as inheriting something from the past, the good and the bad, and then having to sort out their lives, which you said is also a mix, and then also thinking about the future and what type of legacy are we going to leave to the next generation and the one after it, and how are we going to make improvements on what's been given. So what are your thoughts on that?
well, obviously, I agree. And if I were to just hone in on, let's say, the economic aspect of it, right? FDR, way back in the Great Depression, called his program the New Deal, okay, which used massive government spending to try and beat the Great Depression. But after 8 years, there was actually more unemployment than when he started with.
Yeah.
Lyndon B. Johnson, okay, he called his program the Great Society to try and beat poverty. But by the end of the 1970s, 17 years worth of stock market wealth had been completely wiped out.
Yeah.
Um, so today we're hearing, all these, again, social programs like the Green New Deal, student loan forgiveness, some other things that, again, all using massive government spending. So if we acknowledge the historical precedents of massive government spending, maybe we can say, okay, it might not be the best way to go about things. It's going to create some unintended consequences. Noble as these goals might be, maybe there's a better way to go about it. And that's why, in my opinion, history matters.
Yeah. So it seems like one of the principles that you're extracting from history is a skepticism of government intervention, right? I definitely saw that in your work several times, and you had some really powerful examples of that, and you just mentioned a few more here now. Going back to the Democratic debates, what I got from them was a very different type of skepticism, and it was towards business. I think it was almost assumed that if you had made money, if you had engaged in the economy, if you had employed people, that you had to be corrupt. Do you think that there's any truth to that, though? Is business capable of corruption to the same extent or similar to government? And if it is possible at all, to what extent should regulation be involved and enforced in order to prevent that?
Sure. I make it, like you said, I make a point in the book of explaining that both government and business tend to employ overreacting people. Okay, that's the common denominator. They both use people, and we're all overreacting. Businesses tend to overspeculate. So just look at the real estate market in 2008.
Yeah.
Now, if we switch sides, government tends to overregulate, which stifles economic confidence. FDR's administration in the Great Depression, they tried to govern how much businesses could produce at what prices. They tried to regulate 500 different industries, but they still ended up with more unemployment. So both government and business, I think, overreach. If the question is, well, which would I rather, be corrupt in an extreme example, I think I'd rather have a corrupt business because I can always choose another business to work with.
Yeah.
There's millions of other businesses out there. Not all of them are corrupt. If I don't like McDonald's, I can go to Chick-fil-A, right? So, whereas there's only one federal government,
Right.
only one. And if the federal government is corrupt, I don't have a lot of options. It has a lot of power to inflict a lot of damage on people because there are no other options, and the only options for people are to simply leave the country or vote in a new presidency, which doesn't happen too often.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of a couple examples. One of them, especially the ones that attract people to socialism and some of the Democratic candidates, one of them was college debt, right? Is as you grow up and you're still developing, your parents or someone tells you that you've got to go to college, and you start writing these checks and taking out these loans to the tune of thousands of dollars. And then, once you land and you start working a job, you realize, this is insane. I'm $100,000 in debt and more, and I have a degree which may or may not pay for it. And I think that's some of the reaction that people have, and they say, "How do I get out of this? I feel like I'm screwed over for the next 10 years or more of my life." And then someone like Bernie Sanders comes along and says, business is the problem, predatory lending, they were coming after you, and then vote for me and we'll erase that debt and give you a new lease on life. So how would you respond to that message specifically?
Um, I think this is where history comes into play. It's always easy to advocate for policies that make us feel better in the now and in the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, I have student loan debt as well, and if I were to just pay attention to my current problem right now, I'll just vote for the person who decides to forgive every one of my bad decisions or the debt that I've
Right.
accumulated.
Right.
Um, that doesn't mean it's going to be the best for the country. So I think what makes America great, why this is such a fantastic example of a government experience in world history, is the fact that, to a large degree, the populace concerns itself with the good of the country as well as their own personal lives.
Yeah.
At least that's the hope,
Yeah.
right?
I think when you describe principles of government in your book, you give some guiding ideas to follow that have shown prosperity. Going back to that example of student loan debt, if someone like Bernie Sanders comes in and the government takes out more debt in order to cover yours specifically, that's great. That solved that for you. But did that fix the problem of how much college costs? Now you have kids and they're doing the exact same thing. To me, it feels like they're taking water out of the bathtub, but they're not actually fixing the problem, of water coming in through the spigot, right? And so what we have to do is start educating people to actually look at what degrees are you pursuing? Is that actually going to allow you to pay off this student loan debt? And if it's not, maybe look at something else. So that education piece to me is very important. And honestly, that's one of the biggest things I got out of your book.
I appreciate that. Absolutely. I mean, one of the main points of the book is, government in and of itself doesn't have to be bad. I think there's a lot of good things government can do, but by its nature, it just doesn't produce anything by itself,
Right.
right? It only survives by extracting taxes from other people. So anything that the government does, any spending that it decides to do, it's going to be about, at most, half as productive as the same productivity in commerce, because it doesn't produce anything. So anything that it spends is going to be taken on debt,
Yep.
right?
So
Uh,
talking about some of those principles one more time, you talked quite a bit about the profit motive and how important that is as a factor for prosperity. Um, so help me understand, because when you have the profit motive being smeared all over TV, you have all of these people starting to vote for candidates who believe that, who attack it as a vice. Would you define self interest as a virtue? And to what extent would you say that plays a role in society actually developing well?
sure. So I'll attack this in a few different ways. First off, I don't believe government should legislate and force good behavior, okay? Because a governed people will eventually only do just enough not to get punished by the law. And that's why socialism is so inefficient. So if we made businesses, as an example, provide their services as a basic right to people,
Yeah.
quality is always going to go down, like we saw in Finland, Venezuela, China, and Russia. So what we have to consider is separating government of society and the culture of society.
Hmm.
If I look at government, all right, China's government, Sweden's government, how they turn their economies around, how the United States turn into the number one economy in the world, they did it by tying self-interest with serving your neighbor.
Yeah.
And that's called capitalism in a free market economy, right? Capitalism turns self-interest into a virtue because it forces businesses to produce the highest quality products at the most affordable prices for their neighbors to buy. Otherwise, they're going to go out of business, right? So the more they serve others, the more money they earn. Now, on the flip side, culture of society is where people can apply compassion and charity and other religious principles. But the government's first mandate should be to create an environment of success and prosperity, because wealth has to be created first before it can be redistributed
Yeah.
based on your own personal belief system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I look at, I think about that. I think Thomas Paine was one of the ones who talked about that distinction. Alexis de Tocqueville was another. For me, one of the things that I've seen, I mean, I just give you some personal examples. I spent about an hour on the phone with a company 2 days ago, trying to get them to cancel our TV for the third time, right? I get letters in the mail trying to get me to refinance my mortgage every few months, it seems like. And for me, the education of knowing, over time from my parents and from other people I've talked to, and investigating, what this means if I were to take out a timeshare or whatever, and actually reading what I would call the fine print is an important part that makes society work, because then, I have that ability to determine the good business from the bad, and those are the ones that get my money and I get their service, and we continue. So, wherever that comes from, that ability to have discernment, and wisdom to make smart choices from the consumer side, so that we're not rewarding businesses that aren't doing what you described in being ethical. So, but yeah, I think that's a very important part. Is there anything else from the book that you'd like to talk about? Again, for me, it was very very important, and I love the duality of it between a story that's kind of got the cover and the intro for kids, which is great because I'm reading stories to my kids every night, and then it kind of shifts in towards the middle and the latter parts into a very substantive, well-researched argument. That to me was the best part of the book. But is there anything else you'd like to share about it?
Well, I appreciate that, and something that I would just want everyone to understand is the reason it's called Two Islands and a Tortoise is I'm using the premise of credibility. A tortoise in reality can live several hundred, 200 years or so. So why not, if he could talk, why not use him as a credible source who's seen everything from firsthand accounts? He's unbiased. He has no other human motivation. So he's going to give it to you straight. And he compares these two islands for the girl in the book, Izzy, which is actually my daughter. And I just want readers to know that there are time-tested principles of government that have worked and that haven't worked in multiple different countries over several hundred years. Why not learn from that? Why not take that and apply it to, as you say, the research that we're doing when we're looking at different candidates and the policies that they're pushing?
Right, and it sucks you out, like I think we talked about in the initial couple of questions. It sucks you out of that, hypersensitive reaction to what's going on today. Allows you to think back, like the tortoise does, a couple hundred years or more, and start to see, okay, there are reasons why I might be struggling today, and I have to deal with some certain problems, whether that's debt or whatever. Getting out of that is very important for myself. Learning why I got into it in the first place is equally important, so I don't do it again. I get out of student loan debt, all of a sudden I'm in healthcare debt, right? And then I'm struggling with the same problem again. So, having more discernment as you approach that. And then the biggest one is leaving a society for the future that doesn't perpetuate the problem. And I think that's where, Izzy is getting that, from the book. She's starting to say, okay, here I'm in this situation and I'm watching these two islands. But then, from the tortoise, I get all of these examples of what's happened in the past so that I can learn from them, grow, and, not make the mistakes, and then follow the things that have done well for myself and for, everyone that comes after me. So,
yeah, and it's,
yeah.
And I didn't approach this book with a preconceived notion. I really I had an open mind. If history says government is great at everything, that's what I would have written about,
Sure.
right? But the book is very It's very neutral. I don't think you'll find the word Republican or Democrat in it. It really is just a very easy read, and it's really supposed to just educate and give a reasonable perspective. Bottom line, personal responsibility is the most predictable and worthwhile business model.
Yeah.
Competition serves the common good, and that's what history has shown me, and that's what I try and communicate in the book.
Well, thanks, man. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks for talking with us. And we look forward to having you again. We'll put the link for the book on in the comments, and then we'll share a couple more posts about it. And if you have any comments for RA, just let us know. We'll be happy to forward those to them. So thanks again, man.
That'd be great. Willing to join anytime. Thanks a lot.